employee handbook is probably pretty important because that would be how you're conveying these policies, right? Even though most employee probably doesn't ever read them,
No.
but that would be your way of saying, hey, it's in the handbook. Hey, this is how, if you want to be promoted, it's in the handbook. Is that how you would display your policies on all these topics to kind of
That
let?
would that would definitely be how you display them, but there's a few best practices that I've seen with handbooks. So first of all, just buying one from your payroll company without, really knowing what's in there and really making sure what's in there fits you is a big mistake, because that happens a lot. Smaller businesses, they just, because all these HR services are offered by the payroll companies, and they're very off the shelf and not customized at all to a company, and people don't realize that. And so I have a lot of small business clients who will give me their handbook, and then I'll go look through it and talk through it with them and tweak it some. So number one, yes, that's how you display your policies. But number two, you need to know what's in there and make sure it works for you. Number three is then you need to follow it if you're a company. And some of the big problems are like the handbook becomes most important with the discipline policy, and generally the all sorts of discrimination, the anti-discrimination and anti-retaliation policies, and what's called the reporting policy that goes along with that. So let me touch on that for a second, because that's important. So every company we're an equal employment hire or equal opportunity employer. We don't discriminate. We have strong anti-discrimination policies, strong anti-retaliation policies. Number one problem is they don't actually follow that, right? They don't do what's in their handbook. And that's the number one way for me to get them as a plaintiff's attorney. When I'm defending a case, I try to use the handbook in my favor as well. So the handbook becomes really important for both the defense lawyer and the plaintiff's lawyer if there is a lawsuit. It's also important for fairness, because people will not generally call a lawyer if they feel they're being treated fairly. And a lot of that jumps from the handbook. But two important policies, as I said, the discipline policy, which we already talked a little bit about. You could either definitely have a progressive discipline policy, or you can definitely have one that has discretion. And that's a decision for the company based on their particular needs. But then you need to make sure the policy is properly reflecting which of those two sort of sides it's on. And an off-the-shelf handbook generally does not do that. Then on the harassment policies, so they'll all have, we don't discriminate for race, gender, disability, age, all the standard categories. And they may or may not have a good reporting policy. That's the thing that I usually see as a weakness, especially in off-the-shelf handbooks as well as small businesses. So a simple way to have a good reporting policy is that you need to give a person 3 different options to report, and they need to know about this, right? That's a big thing I use when I'm on the plaintiff side, where, they'll say, oh, they got the handbook and it says don't discriminate, and it says to, report to their manager. Well, often the manager is the harasser. And so if that's the case, I'm like, okay, well, this isn't a proper policy. And so the ideal policy has, like, you first report to your supervisor. If not, there's a second level. You go to your manager, you go to HR, and the best policies have either a neutral party, like an HR person separate from that, or an anonymous type of, like, a phone number.
So what would you say for like a business that isn't structured in a way where they have multi-level supervisors, say like a restaurant or a single store retail space that has like the owner and maybe like the store manager?
So the way you would do that is you would have whoever you can have in that group. Like, usually there's some sort of ops manager, or the person who sort of handles the HR. Even in the smallest companies, it's usually the ops manager for some reason. So you would have the manager, the direct supervisor of the person. There's usually at least one higher level manager or owner, like you said, for a small business. And then there's some person usually a different person who provides some function of HR. So that would be a way to find 3 people. And let me tell you why that's important, okay? So if a handbook has a clear reporting policy, and if you can prove the employee read it or had an opportunity to read it, which you do by making sure at hiring you hand them the handbook and you get them to sign that they received it and that they understand it. Even if you don't see them read it, it's on them to sign that contract. Then it's on them to read it. So if you can prove that the person had the handbook, read the handbook, your reporting policy is proper, and it gives these multiple levels, to report to, then you have what's called an affirmative defense. And that means if you're sued, even if you did wrong, like if you are liable, you don't actually have to pay damages. Like it caps the damages or cuts off the damages. And here's why. If a company is not on notice that they have, manager Joe Smith is, harassing Jeannie for whatever, sex, disability, whatever. If they have no notice, they can't be held liable, meaning they can't be held for money. So it could be Joe Smith did bad, but company doesn't have to pay anything. That's how the affirmative defense works. Joe could have done,
Because they have those three different levels, and if they can prove that they were never informed about it?
so the way the affirmative defense is worded is that if if there's a anti or non-harassment policy and a reporting policy is sort of inferred in there, because that's the way you do this. If a person who claims discrimination or harassment, and the words are this, unreasonably fails to utilize the reporting policy, then the company, they win on this affirmative defense. Meaning, again, Joe Smith could have been the worst harasser ever to walk the planet. But if me, Jane, failed to report him, and there was a good policy in place that, gave me options, like let's say Joe is my supervisor and my policy says you have to report it to your supervisor and gives you no other option, well, that person reasonably failed to utilize the policy. But if there's 3 levels, it's pretty hard to have it be unreasonably failing to utilize the policy. So Joe harasses me, Jane, and I don't report it to anybody, and you can prove that I read the handbook, my reporting policy has 3 levels, or something to give their options.
At least
And
2, right?
something. I mean, I could look at them and get creative given the circumstances. I'm sure there's vendors that you could do I'm sure there's like vendors for HR, like hotlines. I guarantee that exists by now. But something creative. If I, Jane, fail to report Joe, and there's a reasonable policy in place, and you could prove that I read it and know it, and I still failed to report, affirmative defense, done. Like, I won't take cases like that. If somebody doesn't report, and it's unreasonable that they didn't report, and I can't prove, like on the flip side, I'm going to try to poke a hole in the handbook. I'm going to try the policy itself. I'm going to try to poke a hole that they didn't really get it or read it. I'm going to try to poke a hole that it was reasonable for them to fail to report because of whatever circumstances. But you will shut somebody like me down when I'm on the plaintiff side. When I'm on the defense side, I'm hoping I have proof they signed the handbook. I have a good policy, and therefore it's not reasonable that they failed to utilize it. And I got a defense, which basically protects the company big time. It's huge.